Between 1847 and 1852, three prominent plantation families in the Tennessee River Valley of northern Alabama suffered complete ruin through circumstances so disturbing that local newspapers refused to print the full accounts. 23 people died across these estates, some from fever, others from accidents that defied explanation, and several under conditions the county coroner described only as unnatural cessation of vital functions. The common thread binding these tragedies remained hidden in ledgers, letters, and testimonies that judges ordered sealed for over a century. At the center of every catastrophe stood one woman whose name appeared in ownership papers, household inventories, and eventually criminal proceedings, yet whose true story was deliberately obscured by families desperate to protect their reputations and a legal system unwilling to confront what her existence revealed about the foundations of Southern society. Before we continue with the story of Rachel, a woman whose intelligence and determination would expose the darkest contradictions of antebellum Alabama, I want to invite you to join our community of truth seekers. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss these hidden chapters of American history. And please leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience connects with these forgotten stories. Now let's discover what really happened in those plantation houses along the river. What began as a routine estate transaction in the spring of 1847 would set in motion a sequence of events that three families tried desperately to stop, even as they found themselves powerless against forces they themselves had created. Limestone County in northern Alabama had prospered through the 1840s on cotton cultivation, with the Tennessee River providing convenient transport to markets in New Orleans. Three families dominated the social landscape of the county's eastern townships. The Rutledge family owned Fairmont, a 2,400-acre plantation worked by 87 enslaved people. Samuel Rutledge had arrived from South Carolina in 1838 with family money and connections to the state legislature. His wife, Catherine, came from Virginia with pretensions to aristocracy. Their household included 3 children, 2 sons at university and a daughter, Lydia, 19 years old, and attracting attention from neighboring planters' sons. 5 miles upriver, James Haverhill maintained Riverside, a slightly smaller but more modern establishment. He was 43, served as county magistrate, and had political ambitions that required careful management of his reputation. His wife Margaret was 10 years younger, and they had 4 children. The third family, the Crenshaw household at Oak Ridge, operated with less pretense but greater efficiency. Daniel Crenshaw, a widower of 51, ran his 1,800 acres with meticulous attention to profit margins. His 3 children were grown, and his household focused entirely on agricultural production. In April 1847, Samuel Rutledge traveled to Mobile and stopped at an estate sale. Among the items being liquidated were 37 enslaved people. One caught his attention. A woman listed as Rachel, approximately 24 years old, described as house-trained, literate, accomplished in needlework and music, fluent in French and English. The listing noted her sale was by special decree and included an unusual stipulation that the purchaser must take her at least 100 miles from Mobile. The price was remarkably low, $400, when skilled house servants typically commanded $100-200 or more. Rutledge's interest was practical. His wife needed someone capable of training their daughter in social accomplishments. A French-speaking, educated servant would address that need while serving as a status symbol. The low price and distance requirement suggested complications, but the auction agent assured him it was merely an estate technicality. Rutledge purchased Rachel and arranged transport to Limestone County. When she arrived at Fairmont 3 weeks later, Catherine expressed satisfaction. Rachel was tall, light brown skin, and carried herself with unusual composure. She spoke with appropriate deference and demonstrated immediate competence. Catherine assigned her to work with Lydia, teaching French conversation and needlework refinement. For 6 weeks, everything proceeded smoothly. Rachel proved exactly as advertised: quiet, efficient, remarkably skilled at managing household dynamics. But by June, changes appeared. Lydia Rutledge began spending excessive time with Rachel, often whispering and falling silent when others approached. The household atmosphere shifted subtly. Conversations became stilted. Servants seemed tense. What no one knew was that Rachel had begun asking careful questions about cotton prices, which planters paid debts promptly, which families had marriageable daughters, which sons gambled or drank. Each question seemed innocent in isolation, but Rachel was assembling a detailed map of power relationships in Limestone County. She observed that Samuel kept a ledger of substantial gambling debts in his study, that he had begun borrowing against future crops at unfavorable rates. She recognized that Catherine's refined manner concealed financial anxiety. Most significantly, she saw that young Lydia possessed a romantic temperament and sheltered understanding of the world, vulnerabilities that could be cultivated. By July, Rachel had become indispensable. Catherine relied on her for social obligations. Samuel appreciated her organizational efficiency. Lydia considered her a confidant. The other servants had accepted her presence. On July 14, 1847, Samuel sat in his study reviewing accounts, showing his financial situation deteriorating faster than he'd admitted to anyone. Rachel entered to bring coffee, and as she turned to leave, she paused. "Sir, if I may be so bold, I overheard you mention the Haverhill family at dinner. I served in a household in Mobile that had business dealings with Mr. Haverhill's brother. There are matters concerning that family's finances that you might find valuable to know." Samuel looked up sharply, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. Rachel sat and began speaking about Haverhill's business affairs, specific details about failed speculations, concealed debts, partnerships with questionable men. She presented these facts without emotion, like reciting inventory. Samuel should have questioned how a house servant possessed such intelligence. He didn't. The information was too valuable, his desperation too acute. Over the next hour, her answers were consistently specific and verifiable. By the time she left, Samuel had decided to use Rachel's information to force Haverhill into a business arrangement that would solve his financial crisis. What he didn't understand was that he had just made himself dependent on a woman who had spent 8 years methodically destroying the 3 families who owned her before the Rutledges, and who had been sold with a distance requirement because authorities in Mobile finally recognized the pattern but lacked legal grounds to do anything except force her removal. The storm that broke over Fairmont that night split the oak tree near the main house down the center. July 14, 1847, marked the beginning of a sequence of tragedies that would eventually require intervention by the state legislature and create legal precedents concerning the prosecution of enslaved people for crimes that existing law could barely conceptualize. Samuel Rutledge initiated his plan with confidence born of desperation. On July 22nd, he called upon Haverhill under pretense of discussing equipment investments. After formalities, Rutledge mentioned disturbing rumors about land speculations Haverhill had undertaken in 1845, including specific details that made clear his knowledge was precise. Haverhill's hands tightened on his chair. The information was accurate, and concerned matters he'd assured everyone had concluded without loss. If word spread that he'd acted dishonorably, his magistrate position would become untenable. Rutledge proposed a cotton factoring partnership with terms that would be mutually protective of both our interests and reputations. It was extortion, dressed as commerce. Haverhill understood immediately. After 30 minutes maintaining friendly pretense, they reached agreement. Haverhill would invest $3,000, solving Rutledge's debt crisis, and Rutledge would advocate for Haverhill's political aspirations. Rutledge left convinced he'd secured his family's future. He didn't question how Rachel obtained the information. Rachel received news of his success with quiet satisfaction, not mentioning that the intelligence came from entirely different sources. Months of careful listening among enslaved people who moved between plantations carrying news white families never imagined reached beyond their households. The other servants noticed Rachel's elevated position. The cook, Bess, watched with unease. "That woman ain't right," she told others. I seen this before down in Mobile. Had a cousin worked for a French family there, told me about a woman like her. Said 3 families broke apart, people died, and nobody could prove nothing. The others dismissed Bess's concerns. Rachel had done nothing wrong. She'd simply earned the master's trust. What they didn't know was that Rachel had begun the second phase, involving young Lydia Rutledge. Throughout August, Rachel continued lessons with Lydia, but subtly introduced new topics. She spoke about limitations placed on women in Southern society, about injustices of a system treating both enslaved people and planter-class women as property to be managed by men. She described parallels between a slave who could be sold and a daughter who could be married off to settle debts. Lydia had never heard such talk. Rachel's words articulated feelings Lydia experienced but never voiced. Resentment at having no control over her future. Frustration at being valued for marriageability. "Your father is negotiating your future like a business transaction," Rachel told her one afternoon. "He has decided you will marry the Crenshaw boy to secure a partnership. Have you been consulted?" "How do you know this?" Lydia whispered. "I see the letters in your father's study. The Crenshaw boy drinks too much and has gambling debts. But your father needs the capital, so your preferences don't matter." This wasn't entirely accurate. No firm arrangements existed, but Rachel presented speculation as fact, knowing Lydia couldn't distinguish between them. "I don't love Thomas Crenshaw," Lydia said. "Love is not a consideration in these arrangements. You are inventory, Miss Lydia. Valuable inventory, but inventory nonetheless. In that regard, we are not so different, you and I." Over following weeks, Rachel built Lydia's sense of injustice while offering sympathetic understanding. She encouraged journal keeping, suggested Lydia had rights transcending her father's authority, painted pictures of women making their own choices. What Rachel was doing was creating ideological justification for rebellion, preparing ground for actions that would shatter the Rutledge family. By September, Samuel's arrangement with Haverhill showed strain. The factoring scheme required more capital than projected, and Haverhill's resentment made him uncooperative. Rachel approached Samuel with new intelligence. Haverhill was speaking privately about Samuel's gambling debts and questionable practices. "He means to ruin you, sir," Rachel said with concern. "He seeks ways to damage your reputation so he might withdraw without appearing dishonorable." Samuel's rage was immediate. He confronted Haverhill publicly at the Agricultural Society meeting. The confrontation became scandal, 2 prominent citizens descending into open warfare. Rachel had achieved exactly what she intended: conflict that would consume both families while she continued work with Lydia. On September 18, 1847, Lydia disappeared from Fairmont. She left a note about rejecting her father's plans and seeking a life of her own choosing. The note contained phrases Catherine immediately recognized as foreign to Lydia's voice, language about natural rights and female autonomy. The plantation erupted into chaos. Samuel organized searches. Catherine collapsed with nervous exhaustion. Every enslaved person was questioned, some beaten. Rachel expressed appropriate shock and grief, claiming no knowledge of Lydia's plans. She appeared genuinely distressed, weeping convincingly. The search continued 3 weeks. Notices appeared in newspapers. Rewards were offered. Haverhill spread rumors that Rutledge's poor household management had allowed his daughter to be corrupted by dangerous ideas. The truth was darker. Lydia hadn't left entirely of her own accord. Rachel had spent months preparing her psychologically, then arranged her departure through contacts in the clandestine network of free blacks and escaped slaves. Lydia believed she was asserting independence. In reality, she'd been manipulated into an action that would destroy her family's standing while achieving Rachel's objective. Chaos that would blind the Rutledges to broader developments. Because while they searched desperately, Rachel had begun cultivating her next target. She'd met Daniel Crenshaw at an August social event and impressed him with intelligence and bearing. Crenshaw, whose household lacked female presence, found himself drawn to acquiring a servant of Rachel's accomplishments. In late September, he approached Samuel with an offer to purchase her. Samuel, desperate for capital to fund the search and increasingly paranoid, agreed to the sale. Rachel was transferred to Oak Ridge for $900, more than twice what Samuel paid, representing significant profit when he desperately needed funds. Rachel departed Fairmont on October 3, 1847. Behind her, she left a family in ruins. Lydia missing, Samuel's arrangements collapsing, Catherine's health broken, the household's reputation destroyed. Bess stood at the kitchen door and made the sign against evil. "Lord, have mercy on the Crenshaw family," she whispered. "That woman carries destruction like a plague." She wasn't wrong. Rachel had already begun her work at Oak Ridge, and Daniel Crenshaw, who prided himself on practical sense and immunity to female manipulation, had no idea he'd just purchased the instrument of his own destruction. The October rains came early that year, isolating the plantations from each other. In that isolation, Rachel settled into her new home and began observing the Crenshaw family with the same clinical attention she'd brought to the Rutledges. She had destroyed one family. 2 more remained, and the most devastating phase had not yet begun. Daniel Crenshaw's Oak Ridge operated with austere efficiency. Since his wife's 1842 death, he'd stripped away social pretensions and focused on agricultural production and profit. His 3 children, Margaret, 23, William, 21, and Samuel, 19, had been raised with emphasis on practical skills and business acumen. Rachel recognized immediately that Oak Ridge presented different challenges. Daniel wasn't easily manipulated by refined accomplishments or feminine charm. He valued practical competence. His children, particularly Margaret, were better educated and more observant than Lydia Rutledge. Rachel adapted. She became indispensable through quiet efficiency rather than conspicuous skill. She managed accounts with meticulous accuracy, identified expense reductions, demonstrated understanding of agricultural economics. Within weeks, Daniel found himself consulting her on matters beyond household management: crop rotation, cotton market trends, equipment purchases. This troubled Margaret, who'd managed the household since her mother's death and resented displacement by a new servant. Margaret was intelligent and practical like her father, but she also possessed something others lacked: suspicion of Rachel's too perfect competence. "Father, do you not find it strange," Margaret said one November evening, "that this woman possesses education far exceeding what one would expect from someone sold at such low price?" The Rutledge catastrophe began shortly after they acquired her. Perhaps that is coincidence, but perhaps not. Daniel dismissed his daughter's concerns. The Rutledge catastrophe resulted from Samuel's poor business practices. "Rachel has been nothing but an asset. I'll not indulge in female hysteria about coincidences." Margaret said nothing further but began watching Rachel closely. She noticed small things: how Rachel's eyes tracked conversations, the subtle questions she asked field workers, the careful attention to correspondents and visitors. Margaret couldn't identify anything specifically wrong, but she developed growing conviction that Rachel was studying the family for purposes having nothing to do with household management. What Margaret couldn't know was that Rachel's strategy for this family required more patience and different techniques. Daniel couldn't be manipulated through social insecurities because he had none. His children couldn't be turned through emotional vulnerability because they'd been raised to value reason over sentiment. Rachel needed to identify genuine weaknesses, not create them. She found what she needed by early December in the plantation's financial records. Daniel had been borrowing small amounts regularly, not large sums, but patterns suggesting ongoing financial pressure, despite apparent profitability. He was paying interest at rates that would become unsustainable within 2 years. Rachel recognized the pattern. Crenshaw was investing in something beyond cotton operations, something expensive enough to require concealed borrowing. She began investigating with characteristic patience. By late December, she'd identified the answer. Crenshaw was attempting to purchase additional bottomland that would nearly double Oak Ridge's size, but required capital he didn't possess. He was gambling that cotton prices would remain strong long enough to pay off debt before it consumed his existing holdings. This was valuable intelligence, But Rachel didn't act immediately. She needed more than knowledge of Daniel's financial situation. She needed leverage for creating specific chaos. That leverage appeared in January 1848 in the form of James Haverhill. Rutledge's business collapse had left Haverhill exposed to his own creditors. The coerced partnership had failed spectacularly, and Haverhill needed new capital. He knew Daniel Crenshaw was the most financially stable planter in the county, and in mid-January, he approached with a factoring partnership proposal. Rachel was present when Haverhill visited, serving refreshments and appearing inattentive. But she listened carefully, and what she heard gave her exactly what she needed. Haverhill was desperate enough to offer extremely favorable terms, and Crenshaw was considering it because it would provide capital flow for his land purchase without revealing his overextension. After Haverhill departed, Rachel found opportunity to speak privately with Daniel. She expressed concern about Haverhill's reputation. "Sir, I don't presume to involve myself, but when I served at Fairmont, I learned that Mr. Haverhill destroyed Mr. Rutledge through deliberate manipulation and false dealing. The partnership became a trap that ruined the Rutledge family." This was complete reversal of the story she'd told Samuel 6 months earlier. The contradiction didn't matter because the two men couldn't compare notes. They were consumed by mutual hatred Rachel helped cultivate. Daniel listened with interest. Over following days, Rachel continued feeding his suspicions with carefully placed comments. She never pushed too hard, but steadily built a case that partnering with Haverhill would be dangerous. Daniel ultimately rejected Haverhill's proposal. Haverhill departed convinced someone had poisoned Crenshaw against him, and his suspicions naturally fell on the Rutledge family. Rachel had now engineered three-way hostility between the county's most prominent families. But this was still preparation. The actual destruction she planned required one more element: exploitation of a secret none of them knew existed. The secret involved William Crenshaw and a relationship he'd been concealing for over a year. William had formed attachment to Anna Pritchard, daughter of an Athens shopkeeper. Far beneath the social station Daniel expected for his son's match. William planned to present the situation as established fact after quietly marrying the girl. Rachel learned of this through her network among enslaved people moving between town and countryside. By mid-February, she possessed complete intelligence. Meeting times, letter contents, plans for a March wedding. On February 19th, Rachel arranged for Daniel to discover his son's secret in the most damaging way. She ensured a letter from Anna to William was delivered when Daniel was present, and William was not. She made certain Daniel saw the letter, not through obvious action, but through creating circumstances making discovery seem accidental. Daniel's rage was immediate and comprehensive. That evening, when William returned, he confronted his father's fury. The argument was devastating. Daniel demanded William end the relationship. William revealed he'd already married Anna 2 weeks earlier. The girl was pregnant. The marriage was legal fact. Daniel responded by disinheriting his son and ordering him to leave immediately. William departed that night, expelled from his family and stripped of expected inheritance. Margaret and Samuel tried mediating, but their father was implacable. Rachel watched these events with satisfaction. The Crenshaw family was now fractured. Daniel's reputation for practical wisdom was damaged. The family's internal unity, its greatest strength, had been shattered. But Rachel wasn't finished. The Crenshaw family's destruction required external pressure exploiting the fractures she'd created. That pressure arrived in March 1848. A man named Josiah Fletcher appeared, claiming to represent New Orleans creditors holding notes on Crenshaw's concealed borrowing. Fletcher demanded immediate payment of $8,000, exceeding Crenshaw's liquid assets and requiring him to either sell land or reveal to his children he'd mortgaged their inheritance. Fletcher's arrival wasn't coincidence. Rachel had arranged it through her network, providing intelligence about Crenshaw's debts to people who could exploit it. Fletcher was exactly what he claimed, legitimate creditor representative. But the timing and aggressive collection had been orchestrated to maximize pressure on an already destabilized family. Daniel, facing financial ruin and family collapse simultaneously, made a catastrophic decision. He would pay the debt by selling a significant portion of his enslaved workforce, 20 people, including families who'd worked at Oak Ridge for over a decade. The sale took place March 28, 1848, conducted rapidly without regard for keeping families together. The enslaved community watched families torn apart, parents separated from children. Rachel observed with no visible emotion. She'd caused this deliberately, with full understanding of the human cost. 20 lives destroyed to serve her larger purpose, complete dismantling of the Crenshaw family's position. Margaret was present at the auction, and for the first time, she saw Rachel's face slip momentarily. Not emotion, but calculation. Margaret recognized that Rachel had orchestrated everything. Her brother's expulsion, her father's financial crisis, the brutal auction. That evening, Margaret confronted Rachel directly. "You did this. My father's troubles, William's exposure, all of it. You arranged it somehow." Rachel met her gaze without flinching. "Miss Margaret, I'm a piece of property. I have no power to arrange anything. Your family's troubles come from your father's decisions and your brother's deceptions. You're a liar and a manipulator," Margaret said. "I will prove what you've done, and when I do, you will hang for it." Rachel smiled briefly. "To prove that, Miss Margaret, you would need to acknowledge that an enslaved woman outwitted 3 prominent planter families. You would need to admit your father was manipulated by his property. You would need to reveal to the entire county that you were destroyed by a woman you claim has no power. Do you really believe your pride would allow such admission?" Margaret had no answer because Rachel was correct. Exposing Rachel's role would require admitting humiliation worse than the destruction itself. Margaret left, knowing the truth but powerless to act. Rachel remained at Oak Ridge, her position more secure because Daniel, desperate to maintain some illusion of control, had come to depend on her competence even as she engineered his destruction. By April 1848, the pattern was becoming visible. 3 families had all suffered catastrophic reverses within months. All had business connections that turned poisonous, and all had at some point employed a woman named Rachel whose presence coincided with their troubles. But visibility didn't equal proof, and proof didn't equal justice. Alabama's legal system had no framework for prosecuting a slave for orchestrated social destruction. Rachel had broken no laws authorities recognized. She'd killed no one, stolen nothing, committed no physical violence. The devastation in her wake was caused by white men's decisions. As spring turned to summer, Rachel prepared for the final phase, involving James Haverhill and resulting in deaths, forcing the legal system to finally confront what she was. But that confrontation would come too late to save the families she'd destroyed. James Haverhill's situation by mid-1848 had deteriorated to desperation. The collapsed Rutledge partnership, followed by Crenshaw's rejection, left him financially exposed. Riverside was barely operational. He needed capital quickly before whispers became common knowledge, completing his ruin. In June, Edmund Fairbanks, a cotton factor from Mobile, expressed interest in forming partnerships with local planters. Haverhill saw salvation. Fairbanks had capital and European market connections. A partnership would solve his crisis and potentially restore his reputation. Negotiations proceeded well, and by early July they'd reached preliminary agreement. During Fairbanks's visit, Haverhill mentioned needing capable household management. Fairbanks suggested his factor's office might help locate suitable servants. As they discussed this, Crenshaw's name came up. "Crenshaw has an unusual servant," Haverhill said. "A woman named Rachel, highly educated and competent. She's said to have almost supernatural abilities in household management and business affairs." Fairbanks expressed interest, and Haverhill arranged a visit to Oak Ridge. When they arrived, Rachel was summoned. She performed exactly as expected, answering questions about cotton markets with sophisticated understanding, displaying fluency in French and impressive mathematical skills. What happened next took place in a private conversation between Fairbanks and Rachel with no witnesses. According to Fairbanks's later testimony, Rachel requested a few minutes on a delicate business matter. She revealed details about Haverhill's financial situation far beyond what he'd disclosed. The full extent of debts, weakness of collateral, and information suggesting he'd systematically defrauded previous partners. She spoke like a lawyer presenting a case, Fairbanks later told investigators. She had specific facts, dates, amounts. She told me Haverhill was trying to trap me in a partnership, making me responsible for his debts while he extracted my capital. She said she was telling me this because she recognized I was an honest businessman being deceived. Fairbanks, shaken, demanded Haverhill provide documentation refuting Rachel's claims. Haverhill couldn't because the claims, while exaggerated, were rooted in enough truth that complete refutation was impossible. The partnership collapsed immediately. Word soon spread that James Haverhill was a man to avoid. Haverhill's rage when he learned Rachel sabotaged his last chance was volcanic. He confronted Crenshaw, demanding the woman be punished. Crenshaw, who had his own reasons to be wary but couldn't admit being manipulated by his property, defended her actions. The argument became public spectacle. Both men said things that couldn't be unsaid. By the time they separated, any cooperation possibility was permanently destroyed. Rachel had now orchestrated complete hostility between three powerful families. But she'd also drawn direct attention to herself as an actor rather than peripheral presence. Margaret Crenshaw's suspicions were now shared by others. Haverhill began making inquiries about Rachel's history, tracing her previous ownership back to Mobile. What he discovered was disturbing. Rachel had been owned by French Creole planter Louis Delacroix, but circumstances of that ownership were wrapped in rumors and sealed legal proceedings. Haverhill learned Delacroix's family had been destroyed by business failures and personal tragedies between 1843 and 1846. Before Delacroix, Rachel had been owned by the Beaumont merchant family, which also suffered catastrophic losses. Before the Beaumonts, records showed ownership by the Robichaud plantation family in southern Louisiana, ruined by events in the early 1840s. The pattern was clear. Every family owning Rachel suffered complete destruction within 2 to 3 years. Haverhill brought this to County Sheriff Thomas Yarborough, demanding investigation. Yarborough listened and was troubled but faced immediate legal difficulties. "Mr. Haverhill, what exactly are you accusing this woman of? She hasn't stolen anything, poisoned anyone, physically harmed anyone. You're describing business failures and family troubles that happened to people who owned her. That's not a crime under any law I know." "She orchestrates disasters," Haverhill insisted. "She studies families, identifies weaknesses, then deliberately causes their destruction through manipulation and damaging intelligence. Even if I could prove that, which I can't, there's no statute making such behavior criminal. You're asking me to prosecute a piece of property for being smarter than the white men who owned her." This was the fundamental legal problem that would plague all subsequent attempts to address Rachel's actions. The law recognized slaves as property without agency. It could punish physical crimes, but had no framework for addressing sophisticated psychological manipulation. Frustrated, Haverhill took different approach. In August 1848, he offered to purchase Rachel from Crenshaw for $2,500, a substantial sum indicating his obsession with controlling or destroying her. Crenshaw refused. Haverhill then attempted to have Rachel forcibly seized on grounds she was dangerous property threatening public safety. He presented a petition signed by himself and several planters, requesting the court order Rachel's removal from Limestone County. Judge Horace Pemberton reviewed and denied it on grounds no specific crimes or threats could be documented. "Gentlemen," Judge Pemberton said, "you are essentially asking me to banish a slave because she is intelligent and because families who owned her made poor business decisions. If intelligence in slaves is grounds for removal, we would need to banish half the skilled workers in this county." This legal defeat pushed Haverhill toward catastrophic actions. If law wouldn't address Rachel, he would take matters into his own hands. In September 1848, he arranged for 4 men to travel to Oak Ridge and forcibly abduct Rachel for transport to Texas, where her history wouldn't be known. The abduction attempt occurred September 14th night. The 4 men approached Oak Ridge intending to seize Rachel from servants' quarters. What they didn't know was that Rachel had anticipated exactly such an attempt. The enslaved community had been warned. When the men arrived, they found not an undefended servant, but coordinated response from field workers armed with farming implements. The confrontation was brief but violent. 2 would-be abductors were seriously injured. The others fled. Daniel Crenshaw appeared with a shotgun and ordered the men off his property. Afterward, Haverhill's involvement became known through testimony from one injured man who confessed hoping for medical treatment. Haverhill was arrested and charged with attempted theft of property, specifically attempted theft of Crenshaw's slave. The irony was brutal. Haverhill, trying to protect the county from what he saw as dangerous threat, now faced criminal charges. Rachel, who'd orchestrated much chaos, was legally the victim. But Rachel wasn't content with this outcome. The abduction attempt had given her an opportunity she'd been waiting for. Because what no one understood yet was that Rachel had deliberately provoked Haverhill into attempting the abduction, had ensured it would fail, leaving him criminally exposed, and had positioned herself to complete the destruction of all 3 families in a final sequence beginning in October 1848. The mechanism involved something growing in the background. Genuine affection between herself and Samuel Crenshaw, Daniel's youngest son. Samuel was 19, idealistic, and unlike his father or siblings, he'd come to see Rachel not as property, but as a person of remarkable intellect trapped in an unjust system. Over months, Rachel had cultivated this sympathy, encouraging Samuel's nascent doubts about slavery while presenting herself as tragic figure deserving freedom. Samuel was falling in love with Rachel, and she knew it. She'd encouraged his affection carefully, never crossing boundaries, triggering his father's intervention, but building emotional attachment she could exploit when the time came. That time arrived in late October, when she told Samuel that Haverhill's associates were planning another abduction attempt, this time intending to kill her to prevent testimony in Haverhill's trial. This was a lie. No such plan existed, but Samuel believed it. Rachel told him the only way she could be safe was if she were free and far from Alabama. She suggested that if someone helped her escape to a free state, she could build a new life where her intelligence would be valued rather than feared. Samuel, driven by love and idealism, agreed to help. He began making arrangements to transport Rachel north through anti-slavery sympathizers. He gathered supplies, planned routes, prepared to accompany her. He was committing crimes, theft of his father's property, conspiracy to violate fugitive slave laws, but he justified these through love and moral conviction. Rachel allowed these preparations to proceed exactly to the point she desired. Then, on November 3rd, 1848, she betrayed Samuel completely. She informed Daniel of his son's plans, presenting herself as a loyal servant who'd uncovered a plot that would destroy the family's remaining honor. She provided Daniel with letters Samuel had written, forged documents, detailed evidence of his intended crimes. Her betrayal was thorough and devastating. Daniel confronted Samuel that evening. The younger man confessed everything: his love for Rachel, his moral objections to slavery, his escape plans. He pleaded with his father to free Rachel and allow them to leave Alabama together. Daniel's response was to have Samuel committed to a private asylum near Tuscaloosa, on grounds his son had become mentally unstable. Then, finally recognizing Rachel as the threat Margaret had warned about, Daniel arranged for her immediate sale to a slave trader who would transport her to deep South cotton districts. The sale took place November 8th. Rachel was chained and placed in a coffle with 15 others being transported to Mississippi. As she departed Oak Ridge, she looked back at the Crenshaw family. Daniel, rigid with fury, Margaret vindicated but devastated by her brother's commitment, the enslaved community watching in silence. Rachel spoke one sentence before the wagon carried her away. "Everything I did, you made necessary." For a moment it seemed Rachel's reign had finally ended. She was gone. The families she'd targeted were broken but surviving, and the legal system had found a solution, removing the threat without confronting uncomfortable questions. But this wasn't the end, because Rachel had left behind one final mechanism that would trigger in her absence, resulting in deaths that couldn't be dismissed as accidents. Deaths finally forcing Alabama's legal system to acknowledge what she was. Just when we thought we'd seen the full extent of Rachel's capabilities, the horror in Limestone County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The first death occurred November 23, 1848, exactly 15 days after Rachel's departure. James Haverhill was found dead in his study at Riverside, apparent victim of self-inflicted gunshot. Circumstances suggested suicide. Haverhill was alone when the shot fired. The weapon was his own pistol, and he'd left a note expressing despair over his impending trial and financial collapse. Margaret Haverhill immediately challenged the suicide explanation. She insisted James would never have taken his own life. She pointed out he'd been working on legal defense strategies and expressed confidence in acquittal days before. The wound placement, shot to right temple from a left-handed man, struck her as suspicious. Most significantly, several financial documents were missing from his study, including papers potentially proving his claims about Crenshaw's business practices. Sheriff Yarborough investigated but found no evidence of another's involvement. The house had been locked from inside, no forced entry was visible, no witnesses reported anyone approaching Riverside that night. Yarborough ruled the death suicide and closed investigation, privately expressing relief that a difficult case was resolved without public trial embarrassing multiple families. Margaret Haverhill refused acceptance. She hired a private investigator from Huntsville, former Pinkerton agent Abraham Cornwall, and directed him to examine not just her husband's death, but the entire pattern of disasters afflicting 3 families. Cornwall was methodical. He interviewed servants from all households, reviewed business records, traced Rachel's history to Louisiana, constructed a timeline clearly showing her presence at every catastrophe's center. Cornwall's December report was damning in conclusions but frustrating in legal implications. The woman called Rachel has systematically destroyed the Robichaux, Beaumont, Delacroix, Rutledge, and Crenshaw families through psychological manipulation, strategic provision of damaging intelligence, and deliberate exploitation of vulnerabilities. However, she has committed no acts that Alabama law recognizes as crimes. She has provided advice freely accepted by white men acting on their own authority. She has revealed information that was already true, not fabricated. In short, she has operated entirely within the narrow range of agency that law permits to enslaved persons while using that agency with devastating effectiveness. Regarding Haverhill's death, Cornwall reached disturbing conclusion. While I cannot prove murder, circumstances suggest careful planning by someone intimately familiar with Haverhill's habits, Riverside's layout, and timing necessary to make murder appear as suicide. That Rachel was not physically present is irrelevant if she arranged for another party to act, or if she set in motion psychological pressures leading Haverhill to actually take his own life. Margaret Haverhill brought Cornwall's report to Judge Pemberton, demanding action. The judge agreed Rachel represented unique threat, but remained stymied by legal constraints. Mrs. Haverhill, even accepting every conclusion in this report, what charge would I bring? She was in Mississippi when your husband died. I would need evidence of specific communications planning the act. The law has no category for what this woman has done. While Margaret Haverhill fought her legal battle, the Crenshaw family struggled with crisis. Samuel remained confined to the asylum, where doctors reported he'd become withdrawn and uncommunicative. Daniel visited once in December and was disturbed to find his son apparently broken, sitting silently, responding with single words, showing no interest in anything. Margaret Crenshaw, who'd warned her father from the beginning, watched her family's disintegration with bitter vindication. She joined forces with Margaret Haverhill in petitioning the state legislature to create new statutes addressing crimes of psychological manipulation by enslaved persons. The petition gained some support but encountered significant opposition from planters recognizing dangerous implications. If law acknowledged enslaved people could commit crimes through intelligence rather than physical action, it implicitly acknowledged their agency and rationality, qualities the entire slavery system depended on denying. This debate was ongoing when the second death occurred. On January 17, 1849, Daniel Crenshaw was found dead in the cotton gin house at Oak Ridge. The machinery had apparently activated while he was inside conducting maintenance, crushing him. The death was ruled accidental, but Margaret Crenshaw knew immediately this was murder. Her father had been careful around machinery his entire life. The gin's activation required deliberate action. Moreover, someone had been at Oak Ridge that day, a former field hand sold away months earlier, who'd returned claiming to deliver a message from the trader, now owning Rachel. Margaret reported suspicions to Yarborough, who investigated reluctantly. He found no evidence of tampering. The former field hand couldn't be located. He'd disappeared immediately after delivering his message. The Mississippi trader, contacted by telegraph, denied sending any messenger and denied Rachel made any such arrangement. Yarborough closed investigation with visible frustration. "Miss Crenshaw, I believe your father was murdered, and I believe Rachel arranged it somehow, but I cannot prove it. The law requires evidence, and all I have is suspicion and a pattern explaining nothing in legal terms." The two Margarets now joined forces completely. They pooled resources and hired Cornwall to conduct exhaustive investigation, focused on one question: where was Rachel, what was she doing, and could they find evidence definitively connecting her to murders? Cornwall traveled to Mississippi in February 1849 and located the plantation where Rachel had supposedly been taken. What he discovered was disturbing. Rachel had been at that plantation exactly 8 days, then was sold again to a trader heading to Arkansas. Cornwall tracked her through 3 more transactions over 4 months, always arriving weeks after she'd departed. Finally, in March 1849, Cornwall found her. She was now property of a planter in eastern Texas named Henry Dalton. Cornwall requested permission to interview the enslaved woman for Alabama legal proceedings. Dalton, intrigued, agreed. Cornwall's interview with Rachel lasted 2 hours and was one of the most unsettling experiences of his career. "She answered every question," he wrote. "She provided detailed accounts of her time with each family. She explained her methods with clinical precision, how she studied each household, identified vulnerabilities, provided information calculated to create conflict, and positioned herself to maximize chaos while maintaining plausible deniability. She described psychological techniques for manipulating individuals, intelligence networks among enslaved people who moved between plantations, and long-term strategies ensuring each family's complete destruction. When I asked why she did these things, she said, "Because I could. Because they thought themselves superior in every way, but I was smarter than all of them. Because they bought and sold human beings while considering themselves civilized, and I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be destroyed by someone they considered beneath notice. Because slavery makes us enemies, and in that war I chose to fight with the only weapons available to me." I asked if she arranged the deaths. She smiled and said, "Mr. Cornwall, I was hundreds of miles away when both men died. I sent no messages, gave no instructions, took no actions that could be considered criminal. If those men died, perhaps it was through consequences of their own actions, or perhaps the people they enslaved found their own reasons to seek justice. You cannot prove I did anything, because under your law, I can do nothing. I am property." Property has no agency. Property cannot commit crimes. Your legal system created this situation, and now you must live with it. Cornwall asked Dalton to place Rachel under guard while he returned to Alabama. Dalton refused, pointing out no charges had been filed, and Rachel was his legally purchased property. Cornwall returned to Alabama in April 1849 with his report, but no prisoner. He presented findings to Judge Pemberton and a special legislative committee. The legislators listened with growing alarm. The committee debated 3 days about response. Some argued for new legislation creating crimes of seditious manipulation. Others objected. Such laws would be impossible to enforce and create dangerous precedents acknowledging slave agency. A few recognized the profound irony. The legal system had created a category of people defined as property without rationality, and now faced crisis because one demonstrated superior rationality while remaining legally powerless. The debate was unresolved when the third death occurred. On May 2, 1849, Samuel Crenshaw was found dead in his asylum room. He had apparently hanged himself using bed linens. Doctors reported his mental state had deteriorated severely and suicide had been a concern, though not considered imminent. Margaret Crenshaw received this news in a state beyond grief. Her father was dead. Her brother William was estranged and living in poverty, and now Samuel had taken his own life. The Crenshaw family, one of the most prominent in northern Alabama just 2 years earlier, was effectively destroyed. She knew Rachel was responsible. She couldn't prove it, but she knew. In her grief and rage, Margaret made a decision. She would go to Texas herself, find Rachel, and kill her personally. It was vigilante justice, but it was the only recourse available. Margaret departed for Texas on May 15, 1849, carrying a loaded pistol and determination to end Rachel's reign, even if it meant sacrificing her own life and freedom. What she didn't know was that Rachel was no longer in Texas. She'd been sold again 2 weeks earlier to a planter in Louisiana. And the new owner was connected, through relationships none of the Alabama families could trace, to the original French Creole family in Mobile that had owned Rachel before she began her methodical destruction of southern planter families. Margaret arrived in eastern Texas in early June after a difficult 3-week journey. She went directly to Dalton's plantation, prepared to confront Rachel. What she found stopped her plans completely. Rachel was gone. Dalton informed her coldly he'd sold the woman to a cotton factor from New Orleans 3 weeks earlier after discovering she'd been systematically gathering information about his business affairs. Margaret demanded to know where Rachel had been taken. Dalton provided the name, Guillaume Marchand, and the New Orleans address. Margaret traveled immediately to Louisiana. In New Orleans, she learned Marchand had purchased Rachel for a client, a widow living near Lake Pontchartrain. The widow's name was Elise Delacroix, the remarried wife of Louis Delacroix, the French Creole planter whose estate sale in Mobile had first brought Rachel to Samuel Rutledge 2 years earlier. Margaret felt ice in her veins hearing this name. The circle was complete. Rachel had returned to the region where her pattern apparently began, purchased by someone connected to her earliest known owners. She traveled to the Delacroix estate on June 24th, arriving unannounced and demanding to see both Elise Delacroix and Rachel. The widow received her in a parlor overlooking the lake and after discussion agreed to summon Rachel. When Rachel entered, Margaret saw something unexpected, recognition and sadness in the woman's eyes. Not fear, not defiance, but something almost like regret, tinged with resignation. "Miss Crenshaw," Rachel said quietly, "I knew someone would eventually come. I did not know it would be you." What followed was a conversation lasting nearly 3 hours. Elise remained present throughout, and years later, both women would provide testimony about what was said. Margaret began by demanding to know why Rachel had destroyed her family, orchestrated deaths, ruined lives. Rachel's answer was comprehensive. She spoke for nearly an hour without interruption, laying out a history beginning not with the Robichaud family in Louisiana, but 15 years earlier in Virginia. Rachel had been born free in Richmond, daughter of a free black craftsman and a French woman. She'd been educated by her mother in reading, writing, French, needlework, and music. Her childhood had been comfortable by standards available to free blacks in the South. When Rachel was 16, her father died in a workshop accident. Within months, creditors claimed his estate and seized his property, including, through manufactured documentation, his wife and daughter, claiming they were enslaved people he'd been keeping illegally as free. Rachel's mother died within a year. Rachel found herself property of a Richmond merchant family, transformed from free and educated to enslaved and powerless through mechanisms entirely legal under Virginia law. "I was not born to slavery," Rachel told them. "I was not raised to accept it as natural. I was educated to think, to question, to understand I was a human being with rights and dignity. And then one day, because white men decided they could steal my freedom, I became property. Do you understand what that does to someone? To know you are capable of everything your owners are capable of, that you are likely more intelligent than most of them, but society has decided you are an object to be bought and sold." She described years following: shock of enslavement, rage that had to be concealed, gradual recognition that physical escape was unlikely, but other forms of resistance were possible. She'd been sold several times in Virginia, then transported to Louisiana in 1839. Each sale taught her more about plantation families, their vulnerabilities, how their vices and fears could be turned against them. "I decided that if I could not be free, I would at least make them pay. I would show them that the people they considered property were capable of destroying them completely. I would prove their assumptions of superiority were delusions, and that their power came not from inherent worth, but from legal structures that could not protect them from someone who understood those structures better than they did." She described her methods: observing families for months, learning secrets, identifying weaknesses, mapping relationships sustaining their power. She'd cultivate information sources among other enslaved people, building networks extending across plantations. She'd position herself as indispensable through genuine competence, ensuring owners came to trust her. Then she'd begin destruction, sometimes providing accurate intelligence to the right people at the right time, turning allies into enemies. Sometimes encouraging vulnerable individuals towards self-destructive actions. Sometimes requiring patience, planting seeds that would grow over months before bearing poisonous fruit. Always maintaining plausible deniability, ensuring nothing could be traced back to her in ways the legal system would recognize as criminal. "The beauty of it," Rachel said with something like pride, "was that I never had to lie. Everything I told each family was true. I simply chose which truths to reveal and when. Samuel Rutledge's gambling debts were real. James Haverhill's business betrayals were real. Daniel Crenshaw's financial overextension was real. I did not create their weaknesses, I simply exploited them with strategic precision." Margaret interrupted, voice shaking. "And the deaths? My father, James Haverhill, my brother Samuel, were those also just strategic exploitation?" Rachel was silent before answering. "Your father's death was not my direct action, but it was my design. I arranged for information to reach certain people who had their own reasons to want him dead, debts he had not paid, promises he had broken. I ensured his movements were predictable and the gin house would be unguarded at a particular time. Someone acted on that information, I do not know who. Haverhill was similar. I never instructed anyone to kill him, but I ensured his despair was complete, that he saw no path forward, and that certain individuals knew he possessed documents threatening them. Whether he killed himself or was killed by another, the outcome was what I intended. Your brother." Rachel's voice softened. "Samuel was different. I did not intend his death. I broke him emotionally to protect myself from his foolish rescue attempt, but I did not mean for him to die. That was regrettable." The word regrettable sent Margaret into fury. She pulled the pistol from her traveling bag, aiming it at Rachel, demanding Elise leave the room so justice could be done. Neither woman moved. Rachel looked at Margaret with steady eyes. "You will not shoot me, Miss Crenshaw, because if you do, you will never know the rest of the story, and you will never understand why Madame Delacroix purchased me specifically to hear my confession." Margaret kept the pistol trained but demanded explanation. Elise provided it. "My first husband, Louis Delacroix, was destroyed by this woman's actions between 1843 and 1846, Elise said quietly. "His business failed, his health collapsed, and he died believing himself cursed. When I learned she was being sold through New Orleans, I arranged to purchase her through my factor. I brought her here not to continue exploiting her labor, but to hear the full account of her actions. She has spent the past 3 weeks writing a confession, not a legal confession but complete documentation of her methods, her philosophy, and her justification." Elise crossed to a desk and retrieved thick papers, perhaps 80 pages covered in neat handwriting. "This document is extraordinary, Miss Crenshaw. It is meticulous account of how an enslaved woman systematically destroyed 6 prominent Southern families over a decade. It is also devastating critique of slavery from someone who experienced both freedom and bondage, who possesses education equal to any scholar, and who used those gifts to wage war against the system that enslaved her." Margaret lowered her pistol slightly. "Why would you want such a document?" "Because I needed to understand," Elise said. "My husband was not cruel by our society's standards, yet this woman destroyed him. I needed to know whether he deserved it, whether there was moral logic to her revenge, or whether she was simply a destroyer who enjoyed causing pain." "And what did you conclude?" Elise looked at Rachel. "I concluded that slavery creates women like Rachel, and then acts surprised when they use the only weapons available to them. I concluded that a system reducing intelligent human beings to property should expect those human beings to resist in whatever ways they can. I concluded my husband's destruction was not random cruelty, but calculated warfare by an enemy he never acknowledged as human enough to be dangerous." "That does not excuse what she did," Margaret said. "It does not bring back my father or my brothers." "No," Elise agreed. "Nothing can do that. But perhaps understanding can prevent future Rachels from being created." Rachel spoke again. "Miss Crenshaw, you came here to kill me. I will not stop you if you choose, but I ask you to consider, if you kill me, you prove the system works, that white people can destroy black people who threaten them. If you let me live, you prove something more disturbing, that you cannot stop someone like me, that your legal systems are vulnerable to intelligence they refuse to acknowledge, and that slavery contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction." Margaret stood with the pistol, facing the woman who destroyed her family, and recognized she was confronting something larger than personal revenge. Rachel was not just an individual criminal. She was demonstration of fundamental instability in the entire social order. She'd proven enslaved people could be more intelligent than their owners, could manipulate the supposedly superior white race, could exact revenge that no law could prevent. Killing her would solve nothing. The knowledge she possessed, the methods she'd developed, the confession she'd written, these would not die with her. And there would be other Rachels, other intelligent enslaved people, driven to resistance by the unbearable contradiction of being treated as property while possessing full range of human capacities. Margaret lowered the pistol completely. "I will not kill you, but neither will I leave you unpunished. I will take your confession to the Alabama legislature and to newspapers throughout the South. I will make certain every slaveholder in America knows what you have done and how you did it." Rachel met her gaze steadily. "That is your right, Miss Crenshaw, but consider, if you publicize my methods, you also publicize my humanity, my intelligence, and my moral critique of the system that enslaved me. You prove we are not the childlike innocents or savage brutes your society claims. You demonstrate we are fully human, capable of sophisticated thought and strategic action. That proof may be more dangerous to slavery than any violence I could commit." The confrontation ended there. Margaret took custody of Rachel's confession. Rachel remained at the Delacroix estate, her future uncertain. Margaret returned to Alabama with the confession and began the process of bringing it to official attention. The Alabama legislature created new statutes in 1850, addressing crimes by enslaved people involving psychological manipulation. But these laws were vague, difficult to enforce, and ultimately ineffective. They acknowledged the problem Rachel represented without solving it, because the fundamental contradiction remained. Admitting enslaved people could commit sophisticated crimes required acknowledging their intelligence and agency, which undermined slavery's entire ideological foundation. Rachel herself disappeared from historical records after 1850. Whether she remained with Elise, was sold again, escaped to freedom, or died, none can be determined from available documents. She vanished into the anonymity of the enslaved population, her specific fate unknown, but her impact lasting. For the families Rachel destroyed, no legal resolution could repair the damage. Samuel Rutledge never recovered from his collapse and died in 1853. Lydia was eventually located in Ohio in 1851, living under an assumed name and refusing to return to Alabama. Margaret Haverhill remarried in 1852 and attempted to rebuild her life far from Limestone County. Margaret Crenshaw never married. She devoted remaining years to managing what was left of the estate and to private obsession with documenting what Rachel had done. In 1867, after the war ended slavery, Margaret wrote in her journal, "I have spent 18 years trying to comprehend that woman. I understand her methods now and her motivation. What I cannot reconcile is that I find myself almost admiring her, even as I hate her for what she did to my family. She was an enemy of great intelligence and determination, and she won our war completely." Margaret died in 1871, leaving behind boxes of documents related to Rachel's case. These papers were eventually donated to the Alabama Department of Archives, where they remained largely unstudied until the 1960s. The confession itself was briefly accessible to researchers in the 1970s before being restricted again. Scholars who examined it described it as one of the most sophisticated first-person accounts of slave resistance ever written. One passage from Rachel's confession appears repeatedly in historical works, her explanation of why she chose psychological manipulation rather than physical violence. "I could have killed individual owners with poison or in their sleep. Many enslaved people have done so and been caught and executed, but individual murders change nothing. They are replaced by new owners, and the system continues. I chose instead to destroy families completely and visibly, to demonstrate that intelligence is a weapon more powerful than violence, and to prove that the people white society considers property are capable of sophisticated resistance that their laws cannot address. I wanted them to fear our minds more than our hands, because they can chain hands but they cannot chain thought." This mystery shows us that intelligence and determination can be weapons as powerful as any violence, but it also reveals the terrible human cost of systems that deny people their basic humanity. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Rachel's actions were justified resistance or inexcusable destruction? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more hidden chapters of American history like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that challenge our understanding of the past. See you in the next video.